Okay, so today what I'm talking about is inflation, unemployment, and also the natural rate of unemployment. And you really got to see the whole video, and then you got to watch this with me in class, and then you sort of get the idea. Anyway, in economics, there's this concept called the natural rate of unemployment, which is structural and frictional unemployment together. And it's really related to the idea of, like, think about Trussonomics, zero hour contracts, free market economics, reform of the trade unions, low welfare payments, etc., low income taxes. And all of those things will reduce this concept, which is called the natural rate of unemployment. And so you get a 50-mark question up here, which is this one. You would literally define what the natural rate of unemployment is, and then you would talk about how you can actually reduce it. The next essay is discuss the view that falling unemployment will inevitably lead to trade-offs with the other macro objectives. So it's basically the idea that if you try and reduce unemployment, then particularly inflation may then take off. Okay, now you could start this whole essay, but just simply by saying that if you're a supply sider and a monetarist, there will be no conflict with all the various objectives on there. Or even if we take Keynesian economics and the Keynesian diagram, which you all know, if you increase AS and AD together, then you can get growth, which will lead to a fall in unemployment, and at the same time will lead to non-inflationary growth. Okay, so the next stage on here is there's this concept called the Phillips curve, which is the first time that you would have come across this, which basically says policymakers have a choice between either high inflation, low unemployment, or high unemployment and low inflation. Now, this was put forward together, obviously, by someone called Phillips in the 50s and 60s, and he went back and looked at hundreds of years of data, and he said that there was a very clear inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment. So you can start off with this one. So in this case, there's a clear trade-off. However, we can disagree with that totally, of course, because in 2019, we had low inflation and also low unemployment. And obviously this was pre-COVID times. And actually during the period from 2010 onwards, we tended to have fairly low inflation and fairly low unemployment. In the 1990s, we had low inflation and low unemployment. So this has obviously fallen into a little bit of disrepute. Right, we then move on to the idea of the long run Phillips curve, which you don't know anything about yet, which is all about trying to reduce the natural rate of unemployment, which is what I spoke about previously. And this is basically free market economics. So if we use free market economics, then that will force people into the workplace, the natural rate of unemployment will fall, and therefore we can have lower unemployment and also lower inflation. However, we can also have the Keynesian approach, which is, once again, you just increase CS and AD together, and we'll get low inflation or price stability and also low unemployment. Or finally, we can end up with the idea, which is that if we do in fact increase growth, which does in fact reduce unemployment, then there is a likelihood that inflation may actually go up, but it will also conflict with other objectives like the balance of payments, because we get more growth, more jobs, we will buy more imports because of the high marginal propensity to import, and that will affect the balance of payments. So in our conclusion, we can say, yes, in 2019, we had low inflation and no unemployment. So that obviously disproves the theory that there has to be a trade-off. But also the monetarist view is a really strong view, which is that if you have supply-side economics, then you can achieve all of your government objectives at once in the long term. However, even then we can slightly disagree with this. We can say, well, inequality might also go up, and we may also end up with climate change. Or we can take the Keynesian view, which is maybe more of an interventionist view. Right now we have a problem of rising costs in terms of energy, where if we sort out the major issues of the day, like energy, broadband, transport, plus we have the free market view, plus if we have a green revolution and that will reduce the cost of oil or the cost of energy, then we can have a situation of where we can still achieve all of our macro objectives at the same time, and there does not need to be a trade-off. Okay, so when you read the package, you'll be reading about this essay, and basically it tells you how to get an A star on that particular subject. Okay, next up on here is we're going to go through unemployment. So in a sense, what I've shown you is like the major picture. Now we're just going to drill down through what is unemployment, how does unemployment work, how do we reduce unemployment. So basically we have two ways of measuring unemployment in the UK. We have the claimant count and labour force survey. The claimant count's a little bit stricter. You've got to be receiving a job seekers allowance to be part of the claimant account. Whereas the labour force survey looks at anybody. They may not be getting unemployment benefit, but they may be looking for a job. So the labour force survey is a survey which will increase your level of unemployment. What they do is they do a survey of 60,000 people, and maybe some people over 60 are looking for a job, but they can't receive job seekers allowance because they're going to be too old. So next up, what determines a natural unemployment? As I've already said, zero-hour contracts. If we increase the tax thresholds, that increases the incentive to go out and find a job. Low income tax. If we train people up, increase the marginal revenue product. Remember this micro diagram here, we can use that one. If we increase the MRP, then we can increase people's wages. Flexibility of the labour market, reducing the power of the trade unions, and increasing occupational and geographical mobility. Increasing occupational mobility might be by giving people grants to move jobs, or we can increase their training, or geographical mobility, giving people housing subsidies so it's easier for them to move. But this is largely a monetary supply side idea that we can reduce the natural rate of unemployment. Okay, we next move on to different types of unemployment. And frictional unemployment is the time it takes to move from job to job. Structural unemployment is if a whole industry closes down, then people will have the wrong skills to move to a different job. So they need to be trained up. So there may be a mismatch of skills in the economy, which may create occupational and geographical immobility. We also have this concept of real wage unemployment, which is maybe that some free market people will believe that the minimum wage is too high. So if the minimum wage is up here, then this creates a real wage unemployment of Q1 to Q3. What should happen if we did a minimum wages is that the wage rate would fall, and therefore society would employ more people. So that's sort of make them up as a monetarist idea. You could get a question on that, but really think once again of free market supply side economics. Or we could have demand deficient unemployment. Demand deficient unemployment is if there is a lack of demand in the economy, then there will not be enough jobs within the economy. Or we could get voluntary unemployment, which is when benefits are far too high, so therefore people will not go to work because they can get more on benefits. In exactly the same way that involuntary unemployment is also called demand deficient unemployment. There's a lack of demand within the economy. And lastly, seasonal unemployment. So what we've looked at now, we looked at the different types of unemployment. We looked at the free market view of trying to reduce the natural rate of unemployment. And then we move on to the next subject here, which is another line of the syllabus, which is what are the economic costs of unemployment? Well, there are private costs. These are the effects of losing your job. This will affect your self-esteem, your confidence, loss of earnings. Rita Bregman, do you remember watching this YouTube clip where it says if people are unemployed, then they become less clever because all their brain power or their capacity is taken up about worrying about how they're going to be able to live. There are also social costs of unemployment, which leads to an increase in crime. And then we've got other economic costs of unemployment, less AD, multiple accelerator work in reverse. You draw the SAD diagram. This is what this means here. We can expand this argument, create some analysis from it. Fall in taxation revenue, which will increase the national debt. There's a rise in national debt. We're going to sell more bonds, crowding out effect and everything else. And then we can look at some of the policies to reduce unemployment. Now, hopefully, as I say that, you will be thinking of those as we are talking through this. Right, so which is the best way to reduce unemployment? Well, really, becomes a really straightforward essay because you either believe in supply-side economics or you believe in demand-side economics, and it also depends upon the situation that you're currently in. Now, fundamentally, if you really want to reduce unemployment, you want to use supply-side and demand-side. With the overriding idea, of course, in the UK, we have been remarkably successful at reducing unemployment. Unemployment is now at less than 4%, which is actually below the natural rate. So we've been very successful in this area, and this is primarily maybe because of supply side economics. Supply side economics, the link in your brain should now go, yes, we've reduced the natural rate of unemployment. What's the natural rate of unemployment? 0-hour contracts, low income tax, low welfare payments, etc., low minimum wage, everything like that. Okay? So, but if it is a demand side issue, then obviously we just want to increase demand side. So 2008, 2009 and 2020 and 2021, financial crash and COVID, we had to increase demand, and we increased demand by increasing G. The problem with increasing G is that increases national debt. The problem with increasing national debt is we're going to sell more bonds, crowding out more interest payments, etc. Paragraph 2, we can also use demand side policies again. We can also use monetary policy. And the monetary policy in 2009, we had low interest rates. We also used QE. And 2020, we're using modern monetary financing to try and increase demand and to stimulate demand in the economy. Or paragraph 3, we can decrease the natural rate of unemployment, which is by using free market supply side policies. Conclusion, which is the best way? Primarily, really, it depends upon the situation. Obviously, in a demand side shock, you would increase aggregate demand, but actually, if you want to reduce unemployment long term, you use supply side policies. And actually, one of those could be training, which increases the MRP, which therefore reduces unemployment. After all, the big mantra from the Tory party always has been, and also from the Labour Party, is that we should have a high wage economy, and to have a high wage economy, we also need a high MRP. Okay, so moving on from there, we're now moving on to inflation. So far we've done the natural rate of unemployment, the conflict of objectives. We're now looking at inflation on here, and we're looking at QE. Remember doing QE in money and banking, explain how QE might increase inflation. Now, in this case, we want to use QE to make sure that demand goes up, and we may want a little bit of inflation within the economy. Using QE, the government prints the money and they buy bonds. The bond price goes up. When the bond price goes up, the yield will go down, remember? Just the coupon divided by the bond price. This will make the rate of interest fall. Therefore, mortgages fall. Therefore, house prices go up. Therefore, people will spend more money and it'll be cheaper to borrow money. Okay, at the same level, asset prices will go up. House prices will go up. Bond prices will go up. People will feel wealthier. Therefore wealthier, therefore they spend more money, therefore that leads to an increase in demand. Thirdly, banks have more cash. If banks have more cash, therefore they lend more money out, hopefully to the real economy, and that will then also increase AD. Right. This is not an essay on do we agree with QE, do we not agree with it, is it a good idea, a bad idea. I think overall we can say that it worked reasonably well within the UK, or that's the line of the Bank of England. However, in theory, that should increase aggregate demand. To what extent do you agree that maintaining inflation at the target rate of 2% should be the top priority of the government? Good question. Now, this question allows you to really talk about any of the macro objectives, but should inflation be the number one target of the UK government? Now, Rishi Sunak certainly thinks so, and if you're answering an A-level question, you will probably go down the line that right now price stability is going to be pretty important. However, it is maybe also important to get growth. I could also make a clear case that the trade deficit is a balance of payments equilibrium. It's a really important government objective. Okay, so that's this essay on here as I flick this over again. So paragraph 1, why price stability is important. Inflation is important because we get inflation, we get a wage price spiral. If we get inflation, then real wages might fall. If real wages fall and demand falls, multiplier accelerator work in reverse. It could also lead to higher interest rates within the economy, less confidence, less international competitiveness, a fall in real wages, less AD. So that is why we want price stability. Okay, we do not want inflation, obviously. Paragraph 2, but maybe we also want growth. Remember Trussonomics, growth. If we get growth, that's really good. We get more FDI, we get more investment. We get more taxation revenue, we get more money spent on the green economy, we get more money spent on public and merit goods, so maybe we should target growth, and that's the most important policy to have. Or maybe some people believe that we should try and solve the trade deficit. Because if we have a trade deficit, that decreases AD, that may lead to a fall in the exchange rate, which may even then create cost push inflation. Now, if you want a decent conclusion, just say that Rishi Sunak obviously believes that price stability is the most important thing. Liz Truss obviously believed that growth was the most important thing to do. And actually, if any decent economist would probably think you want to make sure that the economic fundamentals of the economy are correct. And actually, you can say that all of these are as important as each other. But what we need price stability so we can get more investment. And we also need some growth. Maybe we want sustainable growth. And then maybe the trade deficit will be solved as well. But anyway, they like asking that sort of question. It does make you think. Okay, and then we lead on to what was inflation. Inflation is rising prices, or deflation is negative inflation, which is obviously falling prices, or we have disinflation. Catches candidates out. So if inflation falls from 5% to 4% to 3%, we still have inflation, but we have disinflation because the inflation rate is falling. That's not meant to say minus, that's meant to say, that's really meant to say plus 4% inflation. Right, and then you could get a really boring question on how do we measure inflation. Well, basically, in the UK, we base it on an average basket of goods, which includes about 1,000 odd different items. And then if those go up in price, then they take an average of all these different items and then work out what the inflation rate is. But every good will have a certain weighting. And roughly speaking, petrol has a weighting of 5% because petrol is quite a significant item. Now, just say for imaginary purposes that the price of petrol went up by 100%, then the additional increase in inflation of the rise in the price of petrol of 100%, that would create an inflation rate or add to the CPI of 5%. Okay, why? Because inflation would have a 5% weighting, okay, 0.05. We would multiply it by 100% because the price has doubled, and that will lead to a price rise of 5%. Okay, use the same example again, where if the weighting was 0.05% and inflation went up by 10%, then this will add 0.5% to inflation. So every good would have a weight to it, even Kellogg's cornflakes, but their weight may be 0.0001. So if that doubles in price, it doesn't have a significant impact upon the consumer price index. So there's criticisms of this, obviously, because pensions have different weightings, right? If you're a pensioner, you spend most of your money on food and petrol. So therefore, they should have higher weightings. You don't tend to spend your money on luxury items, on the latest fashions. Then move on to the effects of inflation that we've already looked at in a way, but I'm just quickly going to go through these to remind you on here. The effects of inflation could be a fall in the value of your savings. You have lots of savings. Then if we get inflation, then those savings will fall in value. So right now, if you have loads of savings in the UK and you're not getting much interest on those savings, then the value of your money will fall by 10% in real terms. Increase the cost of doing business, which they may not be able to pass on to the consumer. There's a fall in real wages. There might be an increase in interest rates because, there is an increase in interest rates right now. UK has record levels of personal debt, and then this becomes dangerous. Loss of international competitiveness. And finally, this will then create a wage price spiral. If we get inflation, then we may get more inflation because people will ask for higher wages. The higher wages will then lead into higher prices, and then higher prices will lead into higher wages. So those are the effects of inflation, and obviously we do not want that within the economy. Okay, so the next question could be, what are the causes of inflation? Okay, well, we've already done this. Cost push inflation, really easy. Increase in the price of costs. We draw a diagram of that. The SRS moves to the left. We can put this on an SAD diagram, and that leads to an increase in the price level, or demand pull inflation, too much demand chasing too few goods. You've already done that, and you will understand all of that. But there's also this idea of the quantity theory of money, which is a Fisher equation, which once again is what monetarists believe in. And remember, monetarists also believe in free market supplies and economics, and they do not believe that you should have large increases in the money supply. And if you do, that will lead to an increase in inflation. Now, here you have MV equals PT. In this situation on here, V and T are stable, okay, according to them. So if you increase the money supply here, this will lead to a rise in prices, and they definitely see a link between the money supply and therefore prices. So if the money supply is greater than the rate of economic growth, so say if the money supply goes up by 10%, economic growth is 3%, so we could buy 3% more goods because of the increase in economic growth, but that will then, in all probability, lead to a rise in inflation of 7%. Okay, so they're very keen, therefore, on controlling the money supply. Now, if I have to explain this in an exam, then I will always draw a diagram like this, and then I'll explain NV equals PT. So we start here, and we make the assumption that we may want to increase demand in the economy, so therefore we decide to print more money. So if we increase demand in the economy, we move from A to B. This will obviously increase GDP, so therefore that will lower unemployment. So we move to B, lower unemployment, with higher inflation, and we're up to the old Phillips curve again. There is a trade-off between the two, but we can accept that. But the problem then is that the labour market will tighten, the workers will ask for an increase in wages, so therefore the SRES will move from there to there. Okay? There's lots of criticisms of MV equals PT. V is not stable. DQE, when we printed loads of money, did that lead to inflation? No, it didn't at the time. If the economy is not at full employment and we have a large negative output gap, will that necessarily lead to inflation from there? Okay? Right. And this is finally we come to the long run Phillips curve. Now I can remember from the very first question we were looking at this. I've never yet, in the last 10 years of examining or watching papers, ever seen this diagram being drawn in an exam, but it could be. Right, and it is quite a useful one to show what happens about the natural rate of unemployment and everything else. Right, so we've understood and we've studied the natural rate of unemployment, which is ways in which we can reduce it, free market economics. Now, economists believe that in a country we have a natural rate of unemployment. And in the UK, we used to think it was 5%. So when the Bank of England was in operation, they say if we reduce unemployment below 5%, then we would get inflation. But right now we have an employment of less than 5%. We do have inflation, but we've had unemployment of 4% and not had inflation as well. Okay. So the idea is, if we are here, once again, it's very similar to the previous diagram that we just done, is we increase AD and we reduce unemployment, okay, on the bottom line here, but at the same time, we also increase inflation. So there's a trade-off between the two. But those workers only accept those jobs because at the moment in time, they are suffering from this idea of money illusion. This is the theory. So they accept the job thinking they're getting a 4% pay rise with an inflation rate of 2%. But once they realise, of course, that they've got a 4% pay rise, but inflation is also at 4%, then they have no increase in real wages. And once they realise this, they will then withdraw themselves from the labour market. That is the basis of the long run Phillips curve. I've given you quite a simple explanation, but I think in the exam it's easier to have a simpler version. So the idea of it is, by increasing demand is once again pointless because that will just lead to higher inflation. Okay? Once again, this is a monetarist argument. This is a Friedman argument. This is like free market supply side again. So you cannot decrease unemployment below the natural rate. That is the key feature of that one on there. Right. Which is worse, inflation or deflation? So I've seen this question come up in an exam. Now this is really hard, and the candidates did really, really badly on the question. Because number one, they have to understand what are the bad impacts of inflation, which we've just done. Inflation is bad because it leads to a fall in real wages. Inflation is bad because it decreases people's savings. Inflation is bad because it will lead to higher interest rates. Inflation is also bad because we lose international competitiveness. Inflation is also bad because it creates macro instability. Okay, but then we've also got to know why deflation is bad. Remember, deflation is negative inflation. And these are reasons why deflation is bad. It's because people delay spending because they think that prices will continue to fall in the futures. Or workers resist pay cuts because you are paid, say, £40,000 a year. You're not going to accept a pay cut. So in real terms, your real wages will increase. But if your real wages increase, then you may find that people will start to lose their jobs because they're not willing to accept pay cuts. This is another problem with deflation. Right. The other reason, quite complicated this, if you have deflation, which is negative inflation, say minus 2%, we cannot use interest rates to stimulate the economy. Because even if you're an interest rate of 0%, so it costs nothing to borrow money, actually just by having your money in the bank, you're still getting a 2%. You're still getting a 2% return. So you can't use interest rates to make people spend more money because your money is still better off by being in the bank. Of course, what you could do, you could use negative interest rates. So you could have a negative interest rate of minus 10%, which therefore means if you keep money in the bank, you lose 10% of it a year, which would be more than the rate of deflation, which is minus 2%. But that'd be pretty radical and pretty crazy economics, to be honest. The burden of debt goes up. We have loads of debt in the UK. We've got loads of national debt, 2 trillion quid. We've got 400% of GDP is personal debt. So if you have loads of debt in the UK and we have deflation, then that, in real terms, the value of that debt will go up. And then deflation can become sort of part of the economy. People expect falling prices. This creates a lack of demand because people don't spend their money, and it's really dangerous. Right. Which is worse? Well, if you sat down with a professor and you said, well, which is worse, inflation or deflation? Right. It's a really hard question to answer, obviously. So how on earth a candidate is meant to answer that in the exam, it becomes like a really, really tricky question. Plus the fact, I've never seen any textbook which says which is worse, inflation or deflation. If you ask me right now which is worse, inflation or deflation, right, it'd be a bit of a guess, to be honest. But I'll probably argue that deflation is probably worse than deflation. Sorry, deflation is probably worse than deflation. Well, yeah, it's a ridiculous sentence. Deflation is probably worse than inflation. Inflation may be easier to deal with, particularly if it's demand pull inflation, because if it's demand pull inflation, we can raise interest rates or we can decrease G, we can cut demand, and that will bring down the level of inflation. However, it's probably harder to deal with deflation and to get that out of the economy. And then I'll probably talk about Japan, is that they've had low growth for a long period of time now because of deflation. However, what I would say is that they're both bad. And what you really want is, it depends upon the size. You get really high inflation, that's really dangerous for the economy, as is the case in the UK right now. If you have really bad deflation, that's really bad for the UK economy. So really what you don't want either. To have macro stability, you want an inflation rate of 2%, which is probably the best way of answering that question. But it's asked for a definite answer. And my definite answer would be, you do not want high inflation and you do not want large negative deflation, because they're as dangerous as each other. However, perhaps inflation is easier to deal with in it from an economic point of view. So therefore you prefer inflation to deflation. So these are just 4 questions that I'm now very, very quickly going to go through. So explain how demand side and supply side shocks might increase unemployment in the economy. Easy. Right, we just draw a demand side shock, fall in AD, draw a supply side shock, a fall in AS. And obviously both of those will lead to lower economic growth, reduced growth. If you have a reduction in growth, that will lead to more unemployment. Evaluate the view that the main objective of macroeconomic policy can be achieved without conflicting with each other. Monetarist vision, of course they can. And they can also have that Keynesian diagram, the golden scenario, what I call the golden scenario, which is AS and AD growing in line together. Okay, so quite an easy question, I think. We could also talk about the natural rate of unemployment in here, free market supply side policies. I would make out the points, and I'll conclude with, I can't see a reason why we can't have free market working alongside intervention supply side, which does in fact go out there and create more jobs. Okay, there needn't be a conflict between the two. The Phillips curve is out of date. 2019, explain the main causes of inflation, hopefully going cost push, demand pull, MV equals PT. I suppose you could also talk about a fall in the exchange rate, creating a rise in import prices, but that is also cost push inflation, isn't it? Evaluate the view that inflation is always preferable to deflation. Right, we've just done that one. Quite a tricky one to answer. And thank God I'm now on to my last sheet of paper right now. Explain the causes of cyclical and structural unemployment. Right, cyclical unemployment, you would draw a diagram of fall in demand, a lack of aggregate demand, negative output gap, and that will create cyclical unemployment, which is also involuntary unemployment, remember. Structural unemployment, this is when a whole industry might close down, the whole industry closes down, Then there's a mismatch of skills because those coal miners might not have computer skills. Occupational immobility, geographical immobility. Will these workers want to move from maybe the north of England to the south of England to find a new job? And then there's the problem of house prices, etc. So I've explained both of those. Explained the view that falling unemployment will inevitably lead to an improvement in the standard of living for people in the UK. Right, okay. So once again on here, we can talk about the advantages of falling unemployment. Right, there's less private costs, there's less social costs, and there's less of an economic cost. And all of those factors will improve the standard of living of people in the UK. However, if those people have short-term temporary jobs, then does that necessarily mean that they then live a stress-free life? Of course it doesn't. And the standard of living is a concept that you must also understand, which is a much broader term. So maybe people's incomes will go up because they've now got a job, but in broader terms, does that give them the freedom from stress? Have they got enough money to be able to have a reasonable standard of living? Have they got enough money to pay their rent? Will they lose their job? Are they on a 0-hour contract? So we can have a big talk about that. We can also then go on to talk about, well, what about climate change? What about the environment? What about the Happy Planet Index? And all these sorts of factors. So, but this is actually, I thought this is a really, really hard question to do. This first bit's quite easy, but you've really got to think your way through that question. And it's come from nowhere once again. 2017 explained how government policies can reduce the natural rate of unemployment. Dead easy, if you understand it. And discuss the view that there is inevitably a trade-off between unemployment and other macro objectives. The reason why I would really like this essay compared to this essay is simply because there's a lot of technical stuff here. There's a lot of good economics we can write about. We can write about the Phillips curve. We can write about the natural rate of unemployment. We can write about the monetarist neoclassical view of economics. And we can write about the Keynesian golden scenario on here. So this is what I've just covered today is a great big handout, which probably covers 15% of the macro course, which I'm asking you to learn. But this is a summary of the whole of that handout. Thank you.